Hello, everybody. Shana Tova. Good Yontif. Growing up, I played basketball, baseball, and classical guitar. Coaches and teammates knew me as an athlete, and my guitar teachers knew me as a musician. In case you didn't know it, part of what makes a classical guitar a classical guitar is its nylon strings. And the best sound doesn't come from playing it with your fingers or a pick, but from carefully grown, shaped, and filed fingernails on your playing hand. And for years, my guitar teachers tried to convince me to grow out these 4 fingernails. And for years, I resisted because, among other things, I didn't want my fingernails interfering with sports, catching a seam, throwing a baseball, or needlessly scratching an opponent in basketball. But my guitar teacher insisted that I could and should still do it because Yankees all-star center fielder Bernie Williams was also a classical guitarist, and he grew out his nails while excelling at the highest level of baseball in the world. So I would go through phases, growing them out in the off-season, clipping them during the season, letting them grow out, cutting them. You get the idea. And then, one day, I was browsing in Guitar Center, and I saw the man himself. Bernie Williams was there in the flesh, trying out the guitars on display in the guitar room. So I summoned up the courage to approach him, and I shared my dilemma. And here's how he responded. People are going to try to make you decide on playing one thing. But you should remember that you can always do both. I did. Despite being a Red Sox fan, his words have stayed with me as a guiding principle in my life. It's easy for others to define us, or for us to define them, or for us to define ourselves by one singular thing. We're either an athlete or a musician. What Williams assured me was that we can not only do both, we can be both. Defining something or someone by one attribute is a philosophic and sociological concept known as essentialism. British sociologist Richard Twine defines it as the belief that people and or phenomena have an underlying and unchanging essence. Essentialism appears in any number of ways. It is the foundation of philosopher René Descartes defining human beings solely by the quality of thinking. I think, therefore I am. Historians overgeneralize the development of history according to one historical event. They essentialize history. Even gender expectations can essentialize people based on only one characteristic about them. The tendency to define the world around us by certain identifiable features is also a part of our everyday experiences. We catch up with people's lives on social media where we can only see a snapshot of another's deep and layered life experiences. Or we encounter people in the 3-dimensional world, but only relate to the part of them that we can see, their role, how they affect us, or the one thing that we know about them. Even as individuals, we can define ourselves by the one thing that we know or the one thing that we think we're good at, even though each of us has many facets that make us us. And further, essentialism is at the roots of stereotype, prejudice, sexism, and racism. By defining someone according to one singular quality that we can see and behaving accordingly, we limit both of our potentials to live fully and often harmfully so. I think of essentialism as antithetical to some of Judaism's primary goals: living a deep and well-rounded life, loving your neighbor as yourself, which you read in the Yom Kippur afternoon Torah portion, and building a healthy community. The Jewish mystical tradition has a phrase for this kind of perspective. It's called mochin dekatnut, which translates to small-mindedness, but it has nothing to do with intelligence, nor does it have to do with any sort of inherent virtue. The founder of Hasidism, the Baal Shem Tov, wrote that there are times that a person can only serve God in the diminished state of mochin dekatnut, and they can serve God anyway. What he's acknowledging is that it's human nature to operate from this narrow perspective, to essentialize, and we keep on living anyway. The opposite end of the spectrum from mochin dekatnut, the diminished state, is called mochin degadlut, the expansive state. Again, without having anything to do with intelligence, mochin degadlut literally means big mind, and colloquially means having an expansive perspective in which we can take in the fullness of each other, ourselves, and the world around us. The Jewish mystics consider mochin degadlut a state of deep and awakened consciousness, ideal for prayer because such openness and awareness creates more points of connection, inspiration, and growth. I think this kind of openness and awareness is also vital for building meaningful lives, relationships, and communities. So the question is, if mochin dekatnut is a natural place to be, going through the world according to these essentialist snapshots, how do we get to a place of that expansive perspective, or mochin degadlut, where we can explore the various identities and perspectives within each of us and our experiences? The Talmud gives us an exceptional tool in this lifelong project of broadening our horizons. It's called a Davar Acher, another viewpoint, explanation, angle, story, or detail that can always expand our view. This phrase was born out of the need to communicate multiple layers of something happening at the same time. It translates to another thing. And whenever I come across it in a Jewish text, I always picture someone saying, and here's another thing. Rabbis of the Talmud would often complement or contradict one another by offering one of these Davar Achers. For example, when the rabbis attempt to define a word, there can be a number of Davar Achers that speak to different elements of what that word means. A Davar Acher might serve as a transition, bringing readers to another important point entirely. Or it might be an introduction to an alternative interpretation of a concept or chain of events. In Midrash and Torah commentary, a Davar Acher presents another equally valid interpretation or elaboration of a specific text. A commentator will even offer a Davar Acher to their own initial interpretation. These alternate interpretations don't cancel each other out and leave nothing in their wake. A Davar Acher suggests that multiple perspectives broaden and clarify our picture. My favorite example of when I need a Davar Acher comes from a commencement speech given by David Foster Wallace. He describes in great detail the proverbial one of those days when everything seems mundane and frustrating and like everyone is conspiring against you. You probably know the feeling. Perhaps Sheridan Road is closed during your morning commute on your very first day working at NSCI. Perhaps a Sirius XM representative calls you on the phone and scolds you when you insist you have more than enough listening options as it is. Or perhaps the takeout counter at Max's Deli is filling an Erev Rosh Hashanah order big enough to feed a medium-sized congregation while you just wanted to pick up lunch before your first High Holy Days as a rabbi. These all hypotheticals, of course. In encountering frustrating situations such as these, David Foster Wallace suggests taking a broader perspective, reminding us that there is always more going on than what our immediate and individual perception can take in. Sheridan Road could have been closed for safety concerns, and honestly, Old Green Bay Road is hardly out of the way. The Sirius XM representative might make their living off of commissions, they might be under pressure from a supervisor, might be facing job insecurity in the plethora of music and podcast streaming options. And the deli counter at Max's, well, they were fulfilling an important mitzvah, providing families with their Rosh Hashanah dinner. There is always a Davar Acher, something else going on that we might not yet notice. Wallace writes, "Please don't think that I'm giving you moral advice, or that I'm saying you are supposed to think this way, or that anyone expects you to just automatically do it, because it's hard. It takes will and effort, and if you are like me, some days you won't be able to do it, or you just flat out won't want to. But it will actually be within your power to experience crowded, hot, slow, one of those days type situations as not only meaningful, but sacred, on fire with the same force that made the stars. Love, fellowship, the mystical oneness of all things deep down. Experiencing that meaningful, sacred love, that fellowship, that oneness could be another way of describing Mochin de Gadlut, the expansive approach, and is what the rabbis were after when they offered a Davar Acher. I suggest that love, fellowship, and oneness is what we are ultimately after as well. There's a children's book written by Margaret Wise Brown called The Important Book that offers a simple, accessible way to attain a Davar Acher way of thinking. She writes with a formula. It names what is essential, then lists all these other characteristics, and then restates the important thing. Here's an example. The important thing about the sky is that it's always there. It is true that it is blue and high and full of clouds and made of air, but the important thing about the sky is that it is always there. In this formula, we can better acknowledge the fullness of the world around us, one another, and ourselves, remembering that there's always a Davar Acher, another important thing. Considering feelings of polarization and division in the country, we might especially consider applying the important thing framework to how we think about politics. I remember when I worked in the New York State legislature, there was one lobbyist in particular who did his very best to block the main legislation the assembly member I worked for tried to pass. Even then, this lobbyist was more than his one role blocking our legislation. I just never saw it, and this was my loss. Essentializing one another according to politics is even more harmful when politics isn't our job. When we encounter someone who holds an opposing political opinion, whether they're wrong, or as Rabbi Geffen taught us last night, maybe we're wrong, or maybe we're both wrong, I'd guess that there are many more important qualities about that person outside of their politics. Perhaps we disagree with them, but there could be a Davar Acher, another thing, a role, a hobby, a job, an identity through which we might still connect. And this requires mochin de gadlut, this expansive approach to each other's fullness of being, instead of mochin de katnut, defining each other by a singular characteristic. Think about it. From our Jewish tradition, even God, who we are told over and over again is one, has a multifaceted identity. Over the course of just Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we refer to God as a shepherd, a judge, a parent, a king. We ascribe 13 attributes to God from the book of Exodus: compassionate, gracious, endlessly patient, loving, and true, showing mercy to the 1,000th generation, forgiving evil, defiance, and wrongdoing, and granting pardon. And if humans are created in the image of God, as we're taught B'Tselem Elohim in the story of creation, then neither God nor we should ever be reduced to one singular articulation or understanding. We are all multifaceted and carry various important identities. Of course, there are times when we have a job to do, and that takes precedence. But in general, it helps us connect if we remember that there is a Davar Acher, another important thing about one another. Or, as I once heard a rabbi say, the goal is to meet people soul to soul, not role to role. With that in mind, if we haven't met each other already, I hope to meet you this way. And I'll get us started. I'm a rabbi, I'm a husband, a son, a brother, a friend, a dog dad. I don't play baseball anymore, but I do keep 2 mitts, a baseball, and a softball in my office in case any one of you or one of your children or grandchildren wants to have a catch. I still play basketball and guitar. I like to ride my bicycle, play chess, study Jewish texts, cook with lots of garlic, and I'm sure a few other things too. I consider it one of the great privileges of being a rabbi that I get to meet you in all of your complexity and multiplicity, or as much as you're willing to share. And not only that, I truly believe that we can create together a sacred community of belonging, growth, and connection in pursuit of greater truths when we honor the fullness of one another's lives and humanities, as well as bring the fullness of our own. Striving to embrace the expansiveness of each moment, moving from mochin de katnut to mochin de gadlut, we can broaden and deepen our lives and our relationships and continue building this community of love, fellowship, and oneness. Gamar Chatima Tova. May we all be sealed in the book of life for a year of expansiveness and fullness, one in which we honor the multitudes within one another and ourselves, open to the limitless potential of all that we can be together. Gamar Chatima Tova.